Welcome back, Beyond Rome listeners. Simone here, and I'm with my colleague and co-host James, and we have a very special guest today, Mary Eberstadt. Mary, welcome to the Beyond Rome podcast.
Thank you, Simone and James.
We're so happy to have you, Mary. And James is going to lead this interview because James was at Philos Catholic well before I joined Philos Catholic or even the Philos Project. Back in early 2023, well before we even, had the Coalition of Catholics Against Antisemitism and our conference at Franciscan University. So, James, I'll turn it over to you since you predate all of us here.
Yes, well, within the small little world of Philos Catholic, which is still very young, but it's great to be here with you, Simone, and thanks for coming on, Mary. It's great to have you. For those listening, if you don't already know who Mary Eberstadt is, she's a great Catholic author and writer. She's known for her book, Adam and Eve After the Pill, which addresses a lot of questions around the sexual revolution and how that affected Western culture and just family life as well. And she's a senior fellow with the Faith and Reason Institute, correct, Mary?
Yes.
Yeah. And then you're also involved with the CIC to different degrees. I believe it's the Panula Chair. Is that correct?
Yes, named for the late great Father Arnie Panula.
There we go. Yeah. CIC is doing great work, of course, as well. But before we jump in here on the conversation, I think it'd be helpful for our listeners to have kind of a framework, some groundwork to build on as we enter the discussion. But as Simone mentioned, we had the conference last year. It was co-hosted with Franciscan University on the anniversary of Nostra Aetate's promulgation. Nostra Aetate was a church document from Vatican II on the church's relations to non-Christian religions. And a lot of what it said about our relation to Judaism was huge in terms of historical import. It was also in the wake of October 7th, although we had started planning this conference way before. But the title of the conference was Nostra Aetate and the Future of Catholic-Jewish Relations at a Time of Rising Antisemitism. And Simone and Mary, we've talked about this before, but you both mentioned leading up to the conference as we were asking you to come and speak, it both came to your mind, is anti-Semitism is that still an issue, especially within the church? So I would love to get your thoughts, Mary. Perhaps we could start with you. Is anti-Semitism a real issue within society and within the church? And what changed between before the conference and after?
Yes, thank you, James. Well, following the trip to Israel with Philos in January, February, around that area, 2023, I would have said that anti-Semitism in the United States was minuscule. I would have said that anti-Semitism on American campuses was practically non-existent. And when the idea of a conference came up, honestly, my first reaction was, do I really have to go to Franciscan? It's a great place, but to take a stand against anti-Semitism, aren't all Catholics against anti-Semitism to begin with?
Right.
Then came October 7th, of course, and the conference was shortly afterwards. And October 7th changed everything because we saw, first of all, that there is rampant anti-Semitism on American campuses. And we saw, in a way shocking to me, that there is anti-Semitism in the ether on social media, including by some people who profess to be Catholic. And so both of these were revelations that I think haunted all of us as we got ready for the conference and really tried to give it our best to make a historic statement of a coalition of Catholics against anti-Semitism. And by the way, the fact that we got hundreds of signatures in the first few hours of issuing the mission statement and that we are continuing to collect them is really important testimony to what you're doing and what the coalition is doing.
Amen. Simone, I know you had somewhat similar mindset going to it as well. Could you share kind of the before and after and how you kind of came to realize just the depth and the breadth of this issue.
Yes, I felt very, because I was on that same trip with Mary in
Right.
February 2023 to Israel, which is a wonderful trip and gesture of Jewish Catholic relations and learning more about the state of Israel and why they don't struggle with the same kind of Western problems that Mary addresses in a lot of her books, right? Why does Israel not struggle in the same way as Americans do with certain social and cultural issues? So again, I never would have thought at that time, at that trip, that the problem of anti-Semitism was as grave as it actually is. And when I was asked to speak at the conference, I, like Mary, had this, and I felt very validated by Mary's comment, which she said publicly, like, didn't know this was still a thing. I thought, okay, well, I can say it out loud too, because if Mary felt that way, I don't have to feel so embarrassed that that I had the same feeling and thought. And when I agreed to speak at the conference again, well before I came to work at Philos, again, most Catholics are not anti-Semitic. Most are pro-Jewish and pro-Israel, but there is this growing trend in the church and the world toward anti-Semitism. So we want to be a part of the movement to keep that in check and to stop it where we see it happening. But you know, I was surprised and shocked and really disheartened with the feedback that I got from certain followers on social media, criticizing me for speaking at the conference, criticizing for Franciscan for even hosting the conference. People I would have never expected, who were almost angry that such a conference would even exist. And I think I don't want to speak for Mary, but I think Mary and I both felt grateful to be part of a conference, especially after 10/7. Again, the planning for the conference was well before 10/7, but once 10/7 happened, boy, did we feel happy to have planned this, to be a part of and have planned this conference, especially as a witness to our Jewish brothers and sisters who must have on some level felt consoled that there were Catholics who were already keeping track and keeping a pulse and a temperature on this growing movement of anti-Semitism in certain peripheries of the church. So it was prophetic, but I think I also felt a consolation that we could be there with our Jewish brothers and sisters saying, we do know this is a growing problem and we do care. And here we have this conference where the coalition is being launched, and it just became all the more relevant.
Yeah. And there's the part where you're combating anti-Semitism, fighting evil, but a lot of what the conference was as well was promoting ties with the Jewish community, especially in America, because we had speakers like Rabbi Mark Gottlieb, Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik, and then Jason Gugerman. Simone, you were on a panel with Rabbi Gottlieb, and then, of course, we were interacting with the rabbis throughout the conference. And on their part, there was this deep gratitude. And it wasn't even like, oh, we need you to be like, hoorah, hoorah, Israel. It was like, hey, we're neighbors, and like in so many ways, we're kind of in the same fight as you when it comes to being an observant Jew and a practicing Catholic. And Mary, I know this is something you spoke about in your own remarks as well, kind of tracing how the evil of anti-Semitism is also something that is at the heart an attack on Christians. It's just, I think, in the essence of it, it's anti-Semitic, and it comes out most strongly. But it's the canary in the coal mine. But through your remarks, Mary, you spoke about your experiences. You bring up 3 stories. One from your childhood with your mother, where she had this incident with anti-Semitism up in New York, where there weren't that many Catholics or Jews. And then also your time with the public interest with Irving Kristol, and then time at the UN as well. And then, of course, your trip with us to Israel. And you trace kind of this thread of, as a Catholic, how you came to understand just how this affects Catholics. But there's a big spread that you go through, because we have the Holocaust, then your own experiences at the UN, and anti-Semitism hidden behind anti-Zionism, and then, of course, October 7th and everything that happened last year. Would you say that the anti-Semitism of the past century is any different than what we're seeing today? Because I think a lot of Catholics would be like, "Oh yeah, the Holocaust is bad. That's terrible." But the anti-Semitism of today isn't anti-Semitism. It's it's they just dislike Israel, or it's just anti-Zionism. Could you kind of go through that and explain? Do you think it is the same? Is it different? What are the differences between then and now?
So, one important difference is that anti Semitism in America is out of the closet in a way that it has not been since the Holocaust. And that's what we've been
Mm-hmm.
seeing in these demonstrations that profess to be pro Palestinian, but are actually about wiping Israel off the map. If you wipe Israel off the map, you have wiped most of the Jewish people off the map. And it's as simple as that. Israel's being held to a standard here that no one else is. For example, there's a Hungarian diaspora, but no one talks about wiping Hungary off the map. Why? Because that would destroy the Hungarian people. It's very obvious. But somehow,
Mm-hmm.
when it's Israel, it's okay to talk about wiping Israel off the map. So that's one way in which I think things have changed, James. But
Mm-hmm.
to put it in a more positive light, I think our conference was important for another reason, which is in addition to drawing attention to this uh, new virulent anti Semitism being taken to a new level in the United States and elsewhere, it was also an opportunity for Catholics to get something across to our Jewish brothers and sisters that I think many have not understood before. Many Jews are aware that some Protestants have deep theological reasons for wanting to protect Israel, and these have to do with the millennium and various different ideas about the end of time, etc. But Catholics have just kind of been hanging around with no deep theological reason of that nature. And I
Mm-hmm.
think what the conference made clear was that for Catholics, it is enough, just as Christians attempting to follow the word of the Bible, to be philosemitic, to stand by our Jewish friends, our Jewish neighbors, Jews we don't even know, because we are called to defend the weak and defenseless. And this is one point I tried to make at the end of my talk. We make a big deal out of being pro life, and pro life is a big tent, and it
Mm-hmm.
surely extends to protecting our Jewish brothers and sisters.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
there's even within the article, I think these were kind of, it was something I wasn't aware of, but during your time at the UN, you spoke about the number of resolutions that came through and how many of them were actually targeted at Israel, which, you know, regardless of whether it had been doing terrible things, it was this weird fascination with this tiny state in the Middle East compared to, the hundreds of other nations that had been around in the last century. What?
Yes, I think that's very important, James, for Americans especially to understand, because no one follows closely what transpires at the United Nations unless you are unfortunate enough as an American to do public service there. But that's what I did. I was ghostwriting at the U.S. mission for the United Nations, and our ambassador was the late, great Jean Kirkpatrick, one of the most interesting political women of the last century, who was always pushing back against this kind of anti Semitic talk, as was Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who had been ambassador before she was, a Democrat, by the way. But
Yeah.
the striking thing is just how much Israel bears the brunt of what transpires at the United Nations. Something like 39% of resolutions during any given year are resolutions against the state of Israel. Now, there are a lot of countries represented at the United Nations. Some of them never pay their parking tickets in New York City because they claim diplomatic immunity. And a lot of them do way worse than that in their own countries and over here. And yet it's always Israel. Americans everywhere need to understand that. There's a moral lopsidedness and cravenness about what transpires in the international arena that I never would have been aware of had I not actually worked there and seen it. And this seems like something one needs to witness to at a time like this, when people call on international bodies to, quote, do something about the state of Israel. People need to know what goes on in those international bodies in the first place, which, in one short phrase, is a lot of anti-Semitism.
Yeah. And reading through your piece, there's this one quote that I'd like to highlight, which is from Ambassador Kirkpatrick, who you worked with. And you mentioned that she said after her service there at the UN, she stated, "I think the Holocaust is possible again. I didn't think so before I came to the UN, but I think so now." If that isn't telling, then I don't know what is. But I think there is this kind of preconditioning behind all of that, which is more than just like a political thing. It's not just political. I think a lot of the things driving this are spiritual. There's this sickness, especially when it's coming from Christians. And Simone, you're big on this. You spoke about it at the conference as well, where you kind of addressed the demon of anti-Semitism. Because for every evil, there is a specific fallen angel, just in the same way there's angels in the Old Testament for specific things, specific purposes. Could you kind of address that? Like, where do you think that comes from? This spirit of anti-Semitism that rises up, and I think it kind of animates a lot of different forms of anti-Semitism, whether it's politically disguised under some sort of political facade. But where do you think that rises from?
Yeah, the same 2023 was also the year that Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, 120,000 Armenians were starved for 10 months of the year and then kicked out of their ancient homeland. So that, I mean, and they've been in Artsakh, in Nagorno-Karabakh, since before Armenians were even Christian. So literally thousands of years, not an exaggeration. I always found that when it comes to Armenians, most of the world, the West, the church, it's pretty apathetic, even though it's the first Christian nation. With anti-Semitism, with the Jews, so the demon of apathy for Armenians, and then with the Jews, like a true like positive hatred. So apathy on the one hand, and then like proactive hatred on the other. I think Jacques Maritain, I wish I had the quote off the top of my head, said it super well, where, Christianity was so embedded in his essay, The Mystery of Israel. Christianity is so embedded in European culture that you can't go after Christianity directly. So the way to go after Christianity is to go after the Christ givers, and that's the Jews. Mm-hmm. So I think he so well articulates that kind of level of spiritual evil, of demonic interplay, that we're going to go after the people. We're going to go after the root, the people who gave us our Messiah.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
For that point, Simone. That's a very important point, and thank you for the quote from Maritain. I think that's another current that is feeding today's anti-Semitism, is that we live at a time when the Western world is rapidly secularizing. And people don't like it when observant Catholics say, stand up for what observant Catholics are taught. And for the same reason, they don't like it when other people of the book stand up for the book. And who got the book first? The Jews. And so even Jews who are not religious, particularly, are caught in the sights of this malevolent force, because they are the oldest example of trying to live by what Catholics call the Old Testament. That explains something that's otherwise unexplained, which is why even irreligious Jews are hated and persecuted just as religious ones are. It is because whether they observe or not, they are emblematic of sacred laws handed to human beings. And that's what the secularists of the world can't bear.
Yeah. And I would say by parallel, the Armenians, a lot of Armenians aren't really into their faith, but to be an Armenian is to be a Christian. Everybody feels that, everybody knows that. So I think what you mentioned about even secular Jews are still Jewish, and they're still targeted simply because they belong to this people that gave us our biblical values,
Yeah.
It's hard to see again, I expect it from secular people, expect it from leftists. Unfortunately, when it happens in our church, that's when it's extremely painful personally, because we came from Judaism.
And there's this incoherence to it as well, I think. Mary, you also speak about the oxymoron of there being such a thing as an anti-Semitic Catholic. It just doesn't work that way. Within the heart of the gospel, it's rooted so much in in our Judaic roots that when you start to sever yourself from that, you do split yourself in a way that is so damaging. And you spoke about people like your mom in the case where she encountered this anti-Semitic woman, and it wasn't like she didn't really know that many Jewish people. She didn't even know that the woman, the teacher that this woman was criticizing for being Jewish, she didn't even know she was Jewish at the time. But she acted from the spirit of the gospel, where she knew this was wrong because of her faith, and she was convicted of that. But you also speak about your time at Yad Vashem and the Righteous Among the Nations, many of them who are Catholics, who during the Holocaust, they weren't political affairs experts. They weren't people who are high up in the church or doing anything particularly important. Many of them were just faithful Catholics who saw that there's this need to protect this persecuted group, and especially the Jewish people who we share this special relationship with. And they acted not out of some sort of like ulterior motive, but because they knew their calling, the calling of the gospel and Christian charity towards the persecuted and our brothers and sisters. Could you speak about that in terms of like how does that splitting exist, where people might feel the need to be anti-Semitic even though they would proclaim themselves to be Catholic?
Yes, well, those are two different points, James, and I'd love to get into them a little. So quickly tell the story from my childhood that I told in the speech.
Yeah.
Again, growing up in rural upstate New York, where there were hardly any Jews or Catholics, nonetheless, we had been taught by my mother, who was Catholic, that anti-Semitism, and I don't think she even used that word, Jew hatred, and racism were completely out of the question.
Mm-hmm.
She taught us this from childhood, even though we didn't know Jews, we knew hardly any black or brown people, etc., because
Amazing
we were
mother.
in the middle of nowhere. Well, the question is, how did she come by this teaching? And the answer is, I think, something that Catholics should know. In her mind, it was part of being a Catholic. She had gone to Catholic school. She had gone to school with nuns of the Order of St. Ursula. And the Ursulines were active in Europe in World War II, saving orphans, especially in Poland, including Jewish orphans,
Wow.
and rescuing kids. And it wasn't long after the end of World War II that these same Ursuline nuns were teaching my mother. And there was just no question, there was no ambiguity about it. And so when she encountered anti-Semitism in her own life, which was rarely because of where we lived, she took issue with it. And I thought this was how all Catholics believed. I thought all Catholics must know this. This wasn't a deep theological teaching. My mother didn't even go to college. It wasn't until much later that I realized that there was a sloppy anti-Semitism floating around in some places within the church. And so that was a revelation in a bad way. But let's talk about the second point. What was a revelation in a profoundly good way was going to Yad Vashem, which no visitor to Israel should miss. And after hours of what we can all imagine and what we have seen, which is terrible exhibits about the rise of anti-Semitism across Europe, the numbers of people killed in the Holocaust, the footage from documentaries, the photos, all of it terrible, indescribable even. At the end of the tour, one ends up in the place where what's documented are the righteous Gentiles, the people who saved Jewish lives.
Mm-hmm.
And an inordinate number of these, inordinate proportion of them come from Poland. So let's go back to what was happening in Poland at the time that the Nazis invaded and occupied it. Previously, there were punishments for helping Jews in other countries in Europe. But by the time the Nazis got to Poland, the punishments were even more draconian, and they included wiping out your whole family if you were caught helping Jews, as happened in the case of a family recently beatified, I believe, the Ulna
Yeah.
family of several members, including a baby unborn, which, according to Father Benedict Keeley, who was also on our trip, was the first time that an unborn baby has been beatified. So that's a theological first.
Right.
And the reason is that these Polish farmers were hiding and helping Jews in their house. And when that was discovered, they were all massacred, of course. So to go through that part of Yad Vashem with that information in mind, that is exactly how badly you would be punished if you were caught doing this thing, was really to be inspired as never before about how much honor and courage can be summoned if the foundations are right. Because every one of those people who helped Jews in Poland risked their entire family and sometimes lost their entire family. Again, it's something that no visitor to Jerusalem should ever miss, because the entire exhibit, the entire series of exhibits, in their enormity throughout, just tell us more about the human spirit for good and for ill than any single place one can imagine.
Yeah. You spoke about your mother in the sense of fighting anti-Semitism, not because of, again, whatever reason. It was because of her Catholic upbringing and this just abiding sense in her that she knew this was wrong, because of her faith. But it feels like there are so many Catholics. I mean, I know Catholics where they might feel that way, but then they seem to allow, because the Holocaust isn't happening right now. Things aren't as bad as it was then. So where do you think? It just seems to me a lot of Catholics, who might have had the same upbringing as me, who are raised Catholic, uh, they somehow allow this Trojan horse in where, uh, again, it's not about anti-Semitism. They just don't like the state of Israel, those kind of things. So I guess the question is, how do you navigate that? Because it seems like people justify, or it's not an issue because it's not as bad as the Holocaust. The Holocaust isn't happening, and the Jews always use that as like a boy who cried wolf thing. Anytime a Jew is attacked, it's the Holocaust, like it's leading to the Holocaust, or it's all anti-Semitism. What would you say the proper Catholic response to the situation today is, where they might see it as, oh yeah, it's a bad thing, but it's not really for Catholics to do. What is the role of a Catholic today to respond to those incidences?
I think the role is to look to Catholic leaders who have responded honorably to what's happened since October 7th and beyond. So, for example, Father Dave Pivanka of Franciscan University flung open the doors to Jewish students at a time when they were being harassed and intimidated on some of the nation's most prestigious campuses. And Franciscan University, God bless it forever, said, "Come on here, come on in, we'll take you in." Why that wasn't followed by every faithful Catholic college and university doing exactly the same thing, I don't know. And I'm not
Mm-hmm.
casting aspersions. I'm just saying leadership like that is inspiring. And sitting around and saying, well, at least it's not the Holocaust, is not inspiring. So
Right.
we should take our lead from inspiring leaders.
Right. Well, and it seems like if it's reached the point where it was another Holocaust, we've already failed. So that's where it just seems so dissonant in a way that people would use that as like, okay, yeah, the Holocaust was bad, but we're not going through that today, and that's kind of besides the point, because there is still a deep injustice and a deep wound, I think, within society, and even among the church, and a lot of it just feels indifferent.
Yeah, I was going to say, even if the Holocaust didn't happen, there's still 23 centuries of anti-Semitism to make spiritual reparation for, and the church should also consider that.
But so I think so few Catholics are aware of that. I'll speak to them and they'll push back and be like, oh, well, didn't the Jewish leaders persecute the early church? And it becomes kind of this tit for tat thing where, well, they hate us too, but that just seems like the wrong mindset. So how do you kind of switch that, and how do we get into more of a positive, I don't want to say bridge building, but what is the response to people who would clearly have some sort of misconception, or they are just going to throw stones, as opposed to just trying to actually understand the history, and that the Catholic Church isn't perfect in every way; it's full of sinners as well. How do you actually respond to that history? Where
Yeah.
I think Catholics don't want to, they don't want to be on their knees forgiving for what the Church did a century or 5 centuries ago, kind of thing. So what do you think the proper solution to something like that is, or a response to that?
Well, one point is that the Holocaust analogy is not so easily dismissed after October 7th, meaning Israel's a tiny country by the standards of the rest of the world. And you've probably seen this same estimate. It would be as if 40,000 Americans had been carried across our northern or southern border, kidnapped, raped, killed, et cetera, et cetera. And what would we have done? What would any country have done proportionately? They'd have responded, of course. The point there is that the desire to kill Jews on a large scale obviously hasn't gone away, or
Mm-hmm.
October 7th never would have happened. But again, I think there's also a more positive point to be made here, which is to tell people that although the history of Christians and Jews together has been marked by transgressions on both sides, more on the Christian against Jewish side than on the other, because Christians had relatively more power and could
Yeah.
more easily deprive Jews of things like the ability to hold property in Europe, for example. But despite this history, it is not uh, something people today can't escape. It is not something we are trapped in forever. We all have the ability here to do the right thing or the wrong thing by our Jewish brothers and sisters. And
Yeah.
the fact that there is a long history suggesting otherwise does not mean that anything is inevitable. And I find that thought liberating, because so much of what people get trapped in is this idea of inevitability. It's inevitable that I
Mm-hmm.
have this identity or that identity, or that as a victim of X, Y, or Z, I behave in these ways. This idea is a kind of cheap neo-Hegelian idea about being
Yeah.
trapped in history, and we're not trapped in history. So that's also part of the message that I think the conference wanted to get out. Yes, admitting, acknowledging that Jews have been wronged by Christian was an essential first step. Now let's talk about the positive things we can do. And
Right.
that's what we did, and that's what we need to do more of.
Yeah. I mean, Philos it's based on the word for friend, of course, can also mean love, but and of course, those two things are intertwined. But the idea behind the Philos project and Philos Catholic is starting from a place of friendship, because it will just become kind of a trench warfare otherwise, where you're going to stay in your isolated side and start shooting at the other side. But there are so many, in my experience, people within the Jewish community where you start to talk about these things, and they always assume that Catholics hate them the same way that Christians would be like, yeah, Jews don't like us. But I've met plenty of Jews who are delighted and surprised that there's, a young Catholic guy who's interested in this friendship and wanting to talk, and, open to this sort of dialogue, not because, they are trying to convert me or anything, but it has to start from that place of friendship. And there's so many misconceptions about what the other side knows. Even, they might only be aware of what Catholics have done to them in the same way that Catholics, they only point towards what Jews had done to them. So there's this unhealthy finger pointing without actually any sort of real engagement on the ground, where you actually have a Jewish friend and you're going through these things together.
Yeah, one of the things I found most moving about the conference was that the Jewish guests there, in some cases, were visibly out of their element in a very Catholic space, right?
Yeah.
Catholic iconography, crucifixes,
Yep.
paintings of holy stories, of saints. And one of them even alluded to this in his talk. And trying to put myself in their shoes, I could see that that would be something that might knock you off balance. But they stayed on balance because of this idea of friendship.
Hmm.
And all the ones I spoke to were very moved that Catholics were standing up in any way
Mm-hmm.
after October 7th on behalf of the Jewish people. And similarly, Simone, I think this happened to you as well. James, I'm sure you saw it too. After the conference, I received messages from Jewish friends, Jewish acquaintances, Jews I never met before, along the same exact lines, talking about how grateful people were for the expression
Yeah.
of solidarity that they did not expect, that they had nothing to do with. And that kind of gratitude should take Catholics a long way toward understanding how close we can be.
Hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, I
It was
agree.
it was so beautiful. Uh,
Well, I want to actually jump into the coalition itself because that's a big project we have going on. And Mary, you've been wonderful for promoting it and writing about it. Of course, your first things piece, which was basically it's like a transcription of your remarks at the conference. It's sort of grand introduction to this coalition of Catholics against anti-Semitism, and the coalition was officially published or established at the end of the conference on October 28th last year. And even before that, we had plenty of signatories who, from Catholic leaders from across the United States in different spheres, sending in signatures, and we've had a big run of them in the last year as well. And we even had a couple come in over the last week where I believe you were speaking somewhere you were speaking. I didn't realize you were speaking there. Then all these signatures came in for the coalition, and I learned that Mary Eberstadt had given a talk there. And I was like, oh, okay, there we go. So even before we get into it, I just want to thank you for all the work you have been doing to promote that, and you have been one of those leaders that I think people can look to see, okay, how do we engage in this space, and how do we positively engage in Catholic Jewish relations as well. For me, then I would ask, there's this deep I think you've inspired many of us at the Philos Project as well, but personally within your own calling and your own work, what is about the coalition and this subject that draws you into it and makes you passionate about it? Because again, there are so few people that would be as outspoken and courageous in their stand in it. So what I'm just curious, because a year ago, like you said, you weren't aware was anti-Semitism a real issue. What would be some points in your life where it became clear that this was something that you felt called to speak and fight for?
Well, thank you, James. And first, I should establish what we all know, but listeners might not. I'm not connected to Philos.
Right.
Very glad Philos exists, but I have no institutional or other connection to it. And I'm just doing this because it feels like the right thing to do. Why? Well, partly it's because in college I studied a lot of German history, learned some of the German language, and particularly focused on modern intellectual history and World War I, World War II, etc. That kind of experience can leave you with a lasting understanding of what the beginnings and middle and end of anti-Semitism sound like. And
Mm-hmm.
that's part of what is resonating these days after October 7th, are the parallels between the dehumanization of Jews in large parts of Europe and the dehumanization of Jews that certain groups hope to accomplish today. So
Yeah.
that's one answer. Another is understanding that some of my mentors were Jewish. I mentioned this in the speech. I mentioned several names in the speech. One was Irving Kristol, who was
Yeah.
a renowned editor and writer, one of the most important minds of the 20th century as far as American politics is concerned, who was also an avuncular boss, who had lots of books around the office about Jewish history, some of which I read. Um, and another mentor from Cornell, Jeremy Rabkin, professor of constitutional law. The
Yeah.
list could go on and on. Those personal connections aren't necessary to doing the right thing this way, but they also helped me to understand, as the United Nations helped me to understand, when you see the demonization of Jews or the demonization of anybody, except a lot of the time it looks like it's the demonization of the Jews, you are seeing something at work there that we as Catholics cannot easily dismiss, and that
Mm-hmm.
is evil, which we believe in, right? So, understanding when we see its face from however large a distance is an important skill for us to hone, I think. So, that's in the mix too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. Simone, do you have anything for Mary? I know I'm the one hosting here, but
Yeah.
just any parting questions for Mary?
I mean, I loved everything she just said. I think it's another way of answering your previous question about how to combat it. I mean, having Jewish friends, I think when you personalize it, it's hard to demonize a person when you know the person. So I don't know that I have another question, but just an appreciation for the real truth of that. It's really
Mm-hmm.
hard to uh, first of all, just do the right thing, period. And when it's not popular. But then when there's a human face to it, it really does incentivize doing the right thing. And I think that in addition to that, I'm very moved by that, and also just moved by the fact that our friendship with Mary and our friendship with the coalition. I mean, many of them are our own friends who are
Mm-hmm.
more and more. I mean, I hope anyone listening just finds the coalition statement and signs it, because every person that does sign it is another encouragement and feeling of friendship to the Jewish community. So, yeah, I really hope that it continues to flourish and blossom. And Father Flannery, in his book, The Anguish of the Jew, said, the blueprint for the extinction of Christian anti-Semitism, it's on paper. We just have to really embody it so that we can move on to, our quote real enemies, so to speak. It shouldn't be within our church. So sorry, that wasn't really a question, but more, I'm just very moved I'm just moved by Mary's, just the names that you listed, because it really does personal. I mean, this is the church. Like it's the person of Jesus through all these faces.
Amen. Thank you, Simone, and thank you, Mary, so much for joining. It was lovely to have you on. We will include links for the coalition, link to learn more about Mary and her work, as well as her essay on First Things and other resources as well. So be sure to check those out, as well as the Coalition of Catholics Against Anti-Semitism. For now, Mary, thank you. God bless, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Simone.
If this episode was helpful for you, please consider sharing it with a friend, leaving a rating and review to help us spread the word, and donating at philosproject.org/give with the comment Catholic to support this podcast. To learn more about becoming a Christian leader in the Near East, check out our Pathfinder free online courses, also on our website. Thanks for listening. See you next week.